Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day Week in Review. Hi, Mr. Adams. I see you there. Thank you guys for coming. We will be wrapping up the last 7 articles published on Founder of the Day, my website, where I talk about the American Revolution all the time. Most of you know that. Now, I do want to say a quick thank you guys for being patient with me the last few weeks. I took that week off. I threw some things off. I've made several changes. Actually, I've gotten really back to the old format, more or less. But thank you for sticking through it with me. And I apologize there was no video yesterday. Apparently Windows wanted to do some updates for 7 or 8 hours or something like that. Don't worry, Mr. Adams. I haven't been putting out enough content for you the last 2 weeks, but that's going to be rectified now. So let's talk about the American Revolution, specifically the founders I've been writing about. So we're going to pop over here. And with this new format, we're going to start out with Brutus. Get the old Brutus out of the way. Talk about the Anti-Federalist Papers. Of course, if you're new here, I spent a year and a half every Friday writing an article about the Federalist Papers, and now I've spent the last almost year writing about Anti-Federalists. So right now, we are going through the essays of Brutus, sometimes called the letters of Brutus, and we're up to number 14, though it says to be continued over here because we're actually on part 2 of essay number 14. There were about 16 of them, but sometimes he had to finish up the following week. Now, there's not a ton to go over in the second part of Brutus number 14. This was published March 6th, 1788. They're already well into the discussions about the ratification and preparing for New York's convention by this point. Now, in the part 1, I'll remind you, Brutus discusses a lot of things that are mostly focusing on court cases, specifically criminal cases, and appeals to criminal cases, and the idea that really a prosecutor can keep appealing not guilty pleas on criminal trials indefinitely. So Brutus doesn't like this, and what he wrote in part 1 of Brutus number 14 essentially not only basically created the entirety of the 6th Amendment of the Constitution, but a giant portion of the 5th Amendment to the Constitution. Again, we discussed that last week. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but one of the responses the Federalists had to this accusation was, well, look, the court systems aren't working appropriately, and we need this federal government to prevent things like Shays' Rebellion. Now, Brutus, who again is probably Robert Yates, though we're not sure, Brutus doesn't like this argument because, first of all, he doesn't actually specifically use the term Shays' Rebellion. They weren't using that yet, but he specifically discussed the uprisings in Massachusetts. And while the Federalists were saying, look, it's because the courts in the state system were not working, we need the federal courts to handle things of this nature, Brutus actually points out, no, the courts were working just fine, but Massachusetts is one of the few states that does permit appeals on criminal cases, and that seems to be part of the problem here. Additionally, Brutus points out that, hey, the courts are working just fine. That's why the Shays rebels wanted to prevent the courts from doing what they were doing. They were working well, but it was the laws being passed by the legislature that were the issue. And that's the heart of the second part of Brutus number 14. Is, no, your arguments that Massachusetts, the courts are not working, that is wrong. Although I did add in this week's article a quick aside about the United States, because I have noticed while I'm reading these Brutus papers, Brutus uses the 2 words, United States, capital U, capital S, usually, although I do notice sometimes it only capitalizes one of those words. But I bring this up because even Brutus, who's arguing against the United States Constitution, which he views as a national government as opposed to a federal government, even Brutus is basically saying, like, yeah, there's more to this than just separate countries next to each other. We are united. He also uses the term union often. I think this is very instructive because, again, this is the foundation of the United States. And although the United States, at the time, people didn't say they were Americans. They would say, I'm a New Yorker, or I'm Virginian, or a masshole, as Matt might put it. Pardon my language. But I am from, my state. And it wouldn't be until after the Civil War, and even arguably after World War I, that people would actually say, oh, I'm an American, instead of their first thought being, I'm a citizen of this state that I'm from. And I've noticed that throughout. I thought since there wasn't a lot to this sequel to Brutus number 14, that I figured I'd throw it in here. So that is a very brief summation of Brutus number 14, part 2. Thank you guys for coming. I'm going to pop over to this next founder over here. Happy birthday, Mr. Adams. Thank you for coming, Matt, and anyone else who's watching. We're going to talk about Francis Hopkinson. Now, I did put these in out of order, so that's all right. We'll just go back. Okay, so the next founder we'll be discussing is Francis Hopkinson, who, in a fashion, is the artist of the American Revolution. So Francis Hopkinson was working in New Jersey. He was actually part of the New Jersey Royal Council, which was essentially the cabinet for Royal Governor William Franklin. Now, he sticks with there pretty long, but once the American Revolution starts really warring, well, Francis Hopkinson leaves that position and sides with the Patriots. It's not long after that that he's chosen as a representative of New Jersey to the Continental Congress. Francis Hopkinson goes to the Continental Congress. 3 weeks later, they have a vote on independence. Mr. Hopkinson votes for independence and would sign the Declaration of Independence, and probably most famous for signing the Declaration of Independence. But I will say, while he's in Congress, he's actually really important to the Navy. He serves, I believe it was 2 years on the Navy Board, which oversaw the creation of the fledgling American Navy, which was never gigantic, but it was there. And additionally, he helps to transition when the French arrive with the might of their Navy to help the Americans. Francis Hopkinson is one of the people, as a member of the Navy Board, who helps accumulate them, not accumulate, acclimate, sorry about that, acclimate the French Navy to join the American forces, for lack of a better term. After this, he actually goes on to become Treasurer of Loans, which was a really interesting position because first it was crucial in helping to establish the Continental, which they hoped would become a legitimate currency. That did not happen, but that was the valiant attempt. But he also really dealt with anything between the Continental Congress and loans from, we usually think, oh, we got loans from Holland, and we got loans from France, and we got loans from Spain. That's not really how it went. The governments did loan us some money at points, but it was usually the government gave permission to private banks and private citizens to make loans to the Americans. And so therefore he was involved with overseeing that little escapade. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, Francis Hopkinson is really known as the artist of the American Revolution, and this is for a few reasons. He wrote a bunch of poetry books and some essays and stories. He's a really great writer. He wrote a song called "My Days Have Been So Wondrous Free." Now, this has been argued to be one of the first secular songs written and published in North America. This is arguable. I would probably argue he is not. There are several other ones. I was talking with Jane Calvert recently about the Liberty Song, for example, which was from a decade before this. He also wrote something called Temple of Minerva, which might be the nation's first opera. And there's a better argument that Minerva is the first opera, as opposed to Wondrous Free being the first song. Either way, just indicating what an artistic soul this gentleman was. And not only that, but, he was working for the United States, the Continental Congress, and he was asked to do something else. As a member of the Navy Board, he was told, hey, can you make an American flag for the United States of America? And while we like to think Betsy Ross did this, and we'll save her story for another time, the truth is the actual design of the American flag was by Francis Hopkinson. And he decided to, and I'm going to pop myself out here. Now, this flag in the background is a Bennington flag, and there's a whole story behind this. But I wanted to point out that this flag is wrong, according to the United States. Because what Francis Hopkinson did is he decided, hey, we should have red on the top and the bottom. And the reason we were having red on the top and the bottom is because at a time when the flag flying on top of a ship at sea was very important, it would be easier to distinguish the American flag on the background of the sky on the open ocean if the top and bottom were red than if it were white. So, that being said, back to Francis Hopkinson, he designs the flag. He doesn't really draw the flag. He comes up with the standard, as it's called, of how the flag should look. Again, the stars themselves were a little all over the place for a while, but and have changed throughout the centuries. But the stripes have remained the same. Thank you to Francis Hopkinson. Hey, what else did Francis Hopkinson do? How about design the Great Seal of the United States? Now, there were certain other people who had some input on this, but the first time it was drawn up by Francis Hopkinson. There were actually a bunch of other things too. Those are the two most noteworthy things he did. But what we think of when we think of the design of the United States, for lack of a better term, the brand marketing of the United States really fell on Francis Hopkinson. Again, between the American flag and the Great Seal of the United States, we still use those to this day. Very interestingly about Francis Hopkinson is he designs these things for the United States, and he does this while he's a member of the Navy Board and a delegate to the Continental Congress. But hey, what does he decide? He says, hey, I'm doing all this artistic work. I should probably be paid for my work, right? And he goes to his fellow delegates of Congress, says, can you guys pay me for this? And he sends them a list, an interesting list. I wish I linked it below. I forgot to, but an interesting list of his demands to be rewarded for his work, including a quarter cask of wine he wants from the Continental Congress. They actually debate this for several months until finally their resolution, they say it in nicer terms than this, but essentially they say, no, you're a delegate, and part of your duties as delegate was to create these things. So, no. Thank you for your service. You did a great job. People 250 years from now will still have that flag in front of their house. Great job, bud. No payment for you. Their attitude was you should have been rewarding a stipend and been rewarded a stipend from your state as a representative, and that should pay you for all of this. And furthermore, the last thing really of note of Francis Hopkinson, and there's a bunch more I could go into, but he ends up becoming a Federalist. And one of the anti-Federalists writes a paper they publish anonymously in New Jersey. And Francis Hopkinson, being a great writer, responds to this with a piece called The New Roof, where he essentially claims that he promotes the United States Constitution, ratification of it, and Pennsylvania would ratify very quickly. And Hopkinson in The New Roof basically has an allegory for the United States where he says, you know, there was a house here and it's not doing very good. And you hire an architect to come in and redesign the framing of the house. And you got to pull some boards down and put some new boards up. But you can save this house. We're just going to give it a new roof. And he compares the people who wrote the United States Constitution, many of whom were his friends, to the architect and the laborers who put a new roof and fix up some of the boards on an old house to make it bigger and better than it ever was. So that is an extremely brief overview of the life of Francis Hopkinson. TJ, I see you there. Thank you so much for coming. Everyone who's here, you're amazing. If you want to hit like, that's great. If not, thanks for being here. I'm going to pop up our next founder, who is Henry Middleton. Great. So the next person we're talking about is Henry Middleton. Henry Middleton is an interesting founder. When the call went out for the first Continental Congress to come together, Henry Middleton from South Carolina was an obvious choice. He'd already been in the Colonial Assembly for decades. He was already an older man and one of the wealthiest people in South Carolina, owned a nice big plantation, a lot of slaves. I should probably look up the number. I'm not sure. More than any person should, but either way, a very wealthy, influential member of colonial South Carolina. So he gets sent to the First Continental Congress to do First Continental Congress things, aka write a boycott and send a petition to the king. And he signs what becomes known as the Continental Association, as well as the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, as most of the delegates at the time, some of who would be loyalists, did at the end of the 6 weeks of the First Continental Congress. What's interesting about Henry Middleton in particular is Peyton Randolph of Virginia had been elected president of the First Continental Congress. Now, at the time, it wasn't president of the United States. The president of Continental Congress was essentially the chairman of Continental Congress to oversee the discussion, keep people restrained, keep order in the courtroom, for lack of a better term. And Henry Middleton was there when Peyton Randolph leaves. Again, it's a ceremonial position, but you did have to sign important things. Any correspondence, any official correspondence from the First Continental Congress or any of the Continental Congresses was signed by the President of Congress. But Peyton Randolph, after they all signed the Continental Association, he heads home for Virginia. But there were still a few things they had to tidy up, so they needed someone to take over. And they elected Henry Middleton, who sits as president of the Continental Congress for 4 days. That's it. Just 4 days, but he does get to be one of those guys on that list. Either way, while they're there, they still have to send the Continental Association that they all signed, they have to send that to England, specifically the state representatives there. Each they weren't states yet, they were colonies. Each colony had separate agents, as they were called, or representatives in London, who spoke for the colony to the crown and to Parliament, but were not actually government officials. Now, two of these people were Benjamin Franklin, who was at this point representing at least 3 states, and Arthur Lee, representing Virginia, a member of the Lee family, whose brothers were there the whole time, would sign the Declaration later. So they need to be informed, and as president of the organization, who's the only signature they needed, along with the secretary, Charles Thompson, who had to attest to everything, Henry Middleton informs London. He informs Benjamin Franklin and Arthur Lee and the other representatives of the colonies, hey, this is what's going on. So Henry Middleton, he goes back home. They all go back home after the First Continental Congress. I like to say the First Continental Congress was 6 weeks long. The Second Continental Congress was 15 years. So he returns for the Second Continental Congress, and as things get a little more radical, Henry Middleton just isn't really comfortable with that. He's fairly conservative, even though he does side with the Patriots, and he does have these grievances against the king. As an older gentleman, he was slow to take up the cause of independence. So he actually resigns and goes home. Who do they choose in his place? Well, his son Arthur Middleton comes in his place, and his son Arthur's a little bit more radical. He would promote independence almost as soon as he gets there, and Arthur would sign the Declaration of Independence. Between the two of them, they're one of the only father-son tandems to sign multiple documents. Arthur would eventually go back and briefly be governor of South Carolina and become one of the most important leaders of South Carolina. Now, as for his father, today's figure, Henry Middleton, after he goes back home, Henry, again, didn't support independence off the bat, but once independence happens, he does accept a position as a state senator in South Carolina. So he goes to the state senate and participates in the new government. He is a patriot, but unfortunately, he is arrested at one point, and by the British. And the British decide, well, Mr. Middleton, I suggest you declare your allegiance to the king, or we're going to, I don't know, hang you. Maybe we'll put you in a terrible prison cell where you can lavish away and get sick. Now, again, Middleton was already not a very old man, but approaching very old at this point in his life. And he was under duress, and he does eventually declare his allegiance to the king. Now, this is just a year before the victory at Yorktown and the war ends. Middleton, although people are not happy that Henry declared allegiance to the king, he's not persecuted like many other loyalists were. He did not have his property taken away from him. He had served with the state. He stuck with the Patriots, despite not necessarily having been for independence in the first place. He does come along when it's decided on. That, and his son being such an important political figure in the state at that point, helps him not get in too much trouble, and he gets to keep his property, which, as Matthew Davenport was nice enough to point out, he had a 50,000 acre plantation and 800 slaves, which sounds like a lot because it was a lot. He has a gigantic plantation owner, and I believe one of the largest slave owners in South Carolina. And that's a brief overview of the life of Henry Middleton. Not his whole life. I started pretty late in his life because, as I said, he was already a leader in the colony when the Revolution broke out, but his 4 days as president of the Continental Congress, for me, is an extremely interesting bit. So, thank you, Mr. Davenport, for pointing that out. I really love it when you guys throw in some extra information. Thank you all for coming. Let's talk about the next founder I wrote about. This is a very special founder. I'm going to take a quick sip of water because I'm under these lights and talking so fast. Try not to drink too fast and spill over my face right in front of everyone. All right. Drank too fast, spilled on my face. Okay. Our next founder is William Floyd. Now, this article that I wrote was my 1,000th article. Yay, I need a sound effect where everyone claps. This is my 1,000th article, and I've been saving William Floyd to be my 1,000th article since I wrote my first article, because I used to volunteer at the William Floyd estate. Before I was doing any of this stuff, I was a young man, fresh out of school, had some free time, and I just loved the American Revolution then, as I did now. And I volunteered at his estate on Long Island. He is the only signer of the Declaration of Independence from New York whose house still stands. And in fact, 2 of his houses still stand, and we will get to that. But first, let's talk about his life. So, at just 20 years old, well before the Revolution, William Floyd's parents pass away. And he was 20 years old. They were older than that. But he was the oldest of their children, and he inherited a plantation on Long Island and his siblings. He inherited responsibility of his siblings. Now, I do want to note, I said plantation on Long Island. New York, as we've discussed a lot recently, was a very interesting place during the American Revolution, especially most of the really wealthy people inherited, they were lords of feudal manors. And that is not it's very interesting. They inherited the manors from the Dutch 100 years before the Revolution. When the Dutch controlled New Netherlands, it became New York, and blah, blah, blah. Here we are. Now, William Floyd, he got from his parents a pretty hefty estate, but it was a plantation in the style more of the South. Now, he never had the 800 slaves that people like Henry Middleton had, but he did have slaves on his plantation. They focused mostly on flax, actually, which could be used for many things. Not only are flax seeds edible, but you could use it to make certain linens and garments of that nature. Of course, just because he had less slaves doesn't make it any more right, but that is the situation they were in when the Revolutionary War seems to be coming to fruition. Now, William Floyd became a leader in Suffolk County, New York, about as the revolution's coming in. He, with his two brothers-in-laws, his sister, is it brothers-in-law or brother-in-laws? I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments. So his brothers-in-law were Nathaniel Woodhull, who we spoke about recently, would go on a long cattle drive, an important early military man who was martyred to the cause early in the Revolution, and was a cousin of Abraham Woodhull, who's head of the Culper Spy Ring. And his other brother-in-law was Ezra Lahamindu, who would later go on to build Montauk Lighthouse, which would be the first federally funded construction project. And the three of them with William Floyd, become really important to the cause in New York, especially on Long Island. And they choose William to go to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. He signs the Continental Association. He goes back to New York. They send him back to Philadelphia. He would spend the majority of the war following along with the Continental Congress. He would go back for a year here, a year there to work in the New York State Senate, but primarily spent the whole time quietly sitting in Congress. He was not necessarily the best educated man. He was educated to run his plantation, but he didn't given the golden opportunities that many of the other high-level elite founders did receive. That being said, he was very studious. He listened to what was going on. He ends up also, we spoke about, Francis Hopkinson would work on the Navy Board. He served on dozens of committees throughout the years, helping to establish the United States. And he did sign the Declaration of Independence, as I alluded to earlier today. Now, his time in the Continental Congress, not only was he was the only Long Island signer, one of only 4 New Yorkers to sign, but while he's away, in 1776, just after the Declaration of Independence is signed, the British famously take Manhattan. But they also took with Long Island. And on Long Island was his house. And they took William Floyd's house. That not only was it used as a place to house officers of the war, it was actually used as a stable. They used his house, which again is still there. You can go visit it if you go to Long Island. They used his house as a stable. Not great. Now, by the time the Revolutionary War ends, after 7 years away, William Floyd can finally return home and go to his stable house and clean it up. And it is kind of destroyed, but they do save it. As I said, still there. They do save it. But at this time, when the war ends, he actually buys some land on the Mohawk River. Now, this is not common, what he does. Most people were investing in speculating in upstate New York and other lands around the young United States. And many of them it did not work out for because they paid too much and couldn't sell it all, blah, blah, blah. William Floyd bought land and he improved it. And he would go up there over the summers for several years improving it. Later, he would move there, but before he moves there, he, in 1789, is then elected as an inaugural member of the United States House of Representatives. He's one of the first people there. And while he's there, he represents New York's 1st District, which now is basically just Long Island, but at the time was all of Long Island, including Brooklyn, then known as Kings County, Queens, and Staten Island, then and now technically known as Richmond County. So he not only represents Long Island, but is the inaugural representative for a huge portion of what we now consider New York City. as I said, he loses re-election, actually, as a Democratic Republican, and then he runs for Lieutenant Governor of New York alongside Robert Yates, who we discussed earlier was probably Brutus, writing these anti-federalist articles, who then became Democratic Republicans, would later be Jeffersonian Republicans. Now, unfortunately, they lose that campaign, and then a few years later, Floyd moves to the wilderness, for lack of a better term, in upstate New York on the Mohawk River, where he improves things. And he actually lives long enough. He's one of the longest living Declaration signers, and he he helps oversee the implementation of the Erie Canal in that area, really sponsors people to develop the land and bring that to fruition up there. And I should note that somewhere in the behind me is the Adams Jefferson letters, and there is one letter in there that always stuck with me. John Adams finds out first that William Floyd dies. And at this point, Adams is about 90, Jefferson's in his 80s, and he writes, the one quote I remember is in with an exclamation point, "Floyd is dead." And it was a sad moment, of course, a founder, an American founder, telling another American founder about the death of an American founder. But he basically then carries on to say, we're fading fast. This is the end of the generation. This is the end of the generation. Adams could only hope that they did their best and what they did would succeed from here on out. Now, I do have this here. Of course, it's gotten covered in papers since it's been sitting here. I'm going to pull this up. This is actually my training manual, and you can't see it because the lights are too bright. But I have my training manual from when I was, the brief time I spent as a volunteer at the Fire Island National Seashore. Now, it's mostly like how to run the parks, and not a lot of great information on the founders, on William Floyd and his family themselves, but I thought it'd be fun to have here. I was going to go through it the other day, but again, it's operational procedures, not what I remembered. So that is a brief overview of the life of American founder William Floyd. I'm getting a little hot, but I'm going to pop up here. And our next founder is Kitty Floyd. Now, that name might sound a little familiar. I'm going to take a little sip of my water. Brothers-in-law. Thank you, Mr. Davenport. Possessive is brother-in-laws. They're my brother-in-laws. Well, if you have both of them, is it brothers-in-laws? Never mind. English is not my thing. So, we are going to talk about Katherine Kitty Floyd. Okay. Our next founder is Katherine Kitty Floyd. Now, Kitty Floyd was the daughter of William Floyd, signer of the Declaration of Independence. She's just 9 years old when the British come to her part of Long Island and take her house possession. And she flees with her family to Connecticut, where they stay with friends who are nice enough to, take care of them for a little bit there. Unfortunately, while they're in Connecticut, Kitty's mother, Hannah, dies. So Kitty goes with her two siblings to Philadelphia to stay with their father, William Floyd, who, had signed the Declaration. No big deal. So they're there, and they stay in the boarding home of a Mrs. House. I shouldn't have put in quotes. Her name was Mrs. House. While she's there, she becomes friends with the Mrs. House's daughter, Elizabeth Triss House, who we've talked about recently. Another boarder, Thomas Jefferson. A bunch of other really famous names, all staying in the same house. And another guy, James Madison. Now, at this point, Kitty had grown up to become a big 15-year-old woman. And James Madison was 32 years old. And I guess it was love at first sight for the nerdy Madison who didn't know how to talk to girls, and the Kitty who was infatuated by a smart older gentleman. So they actually get engaged to be married. And in fact, this image next to me is one of two miniatures made by Charles Willson Peale, one of the artists of the American Revolution. He made one of her and one of James Madison that they exchanged. Now, about this time, the Revolutionary War comes to an end. And William Floyd and his family, including Katherine Floyd, are able to return to their home, finally. And James Madison accompanies them as far as New Brunswick, New Jersey, where they say their adieus. And, I'll see you soon. We'll get married. Let's set that date. And then, from my understanding, Madison and Kitty never see each other again. Turns out, Kitty meets another guy, William Clarkson, who was 19 years old, which is a lot closer in age than 32-year-old Madison, with, again, a 15-year-old woman. No offense, I'm putting it in quotes because 15 is still child from my perspective. But either way, Catherine decides to break off the engagement to Madison and instead marry the Mr. Clarkson. Now, they do go back, they fix up the home, they seem to have a happy life, but he passes away in 1812, her husband William, but Catherine continues to live her life, and actually it's interesting because in William Floyd's will, he says he doesn't give all that much money to Kitty because he accuses her of spending kind of lavishly and cavalierly, and not taking enough, paying enough attention to her expenses. He does lighten up and writes another will a few years later where he gives her a little bit more money and is a little bit cooler. But she ends up living the last several years of her life with her daughter in New York City, and she dies in 1832. Not that long after her father, but into her 60s, so she lives a fairly long life. Interestingly, as for James Madison, he marries Dolly Madison, Dolly Payne Todd, who becomes famous as the first lady to act like a first lady, so to speak. I don't want to say that wrong, but either way, Madison goes on to finish his life, be president, write a constitution, and that kind of thing, if you're into that. Kitty Floyd, he never seems to forget Kitty Floyd, however, because in the 1830s, about the time Kitty Floyd passes away, Madison comes across an old letter that he had written about her, and he ends up scribbling out everything he wrote, and this is 50 years later. This is 50 years later he finds his letter and scribbles it out. Now, is this because he didn't, he had been married to Dolly for so long and didn't want posterity to look back at his earlier love and think negatively on his spouse? Possibly. We'll never know, and we'll never know what the feelings were of that heartbroken 32-year-old in the 1780s when he wrote that last letter. But it does seem that it at least affected him enough where he had to scribble it out as an old man. So that is a brief overview, although that's actually a pretty substantial overview of what we know about Kitty Floyd. Let's see. We're cruising right along here. Living the dream. Living the dream. Okay. Josiah Harmar. I have a lot of trouble with this name. I don't know why. It shouldn't be that hard. Josiah Harmar. This is actually a gentleman I did not know a ton about. I am surprised by how important he is, considering I've only come across his name a handful of times over my years of research. So let's talk about him. Oh, look at you guys. All right. Our next founder is Josiah Harmar. So Josiah Harmar was a pretty well-educated young man when the American Revolution broke out, and he was only in his mid-20s, but he's chosen to serve as aide-de-camp to several generals during the Revolutionary War, which is obviously important. He makes such a name for himself that when the war is over, the representatives in Europe write the Treaty of Paris, and they send it back to the colonies to be ratified. And the Continental Congress, of course, ratifies the Treaty of Paris and sends it back to France. And who did they entrust to carry this extremely important document over to Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane? No, Deane was not there anymore, but Benjamin Franklin and Arthur Lee and the other delegates, John Adams in Paris. Josiah Harmar. They give Josiah Harmar the document and he goes to Paris. And that's usually where this story would end. I'd expand on that, and that would be why he's the founder of the day. But he went through a whole lot more, because while he's in Paris, he spends pretty lavishly. I mean, he meets King Louis and Marie Antoinette. He rides with the elite of Paris for about a year and takes on a whole lot of debt. And with all this debt, he has to get a job, and he's good at being a soldier. So he comes back to the United States the following year and rejoins the army. Now, at this point, as we discussed earlier in the week with John Doughty, the Continental Army, now known as the United States Army, was shrunk to less than 100 people because everyone went back to their separate states under the Articles of Confederation. But just as the war ends, America receives all this land from Great Britain that we now call the Old Northwest, but what they then called the Northwest Territory. Basically Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, parts of Michigan and Wisconsin, that part of the world around the Great Lakes. But see, there were a whole bunch of Native Americans living there who didn't want the Americans to have any part of living there. That being said, the Americans certainly wanted to live there, and they sent Josiah Harmar to take over for John Doughty as the senior officer of the United States Army. He goes there, and, well, there's not a lot of great things that happen. He builds some forts. One he names after himself, Fort Harmar. Pretty sweet, if you ask me. Name a fort after yourself. Which is now right outside Marietta, which, while he was there, would start being settled by Rufus Putnam, another veteran of the Revolutionary War. And Marietta became the first real town and even city in Ohio, and part of the reason was Fort Harmar was right there to protect it. That being said, he spends time at Fort McIntosh, spends time at Fort Washington. He's traveling around Fort Pitt. He's in charge. He's trying to assemble all these people, and he starts to treat with the Native Americans. And he signs a few treaties with the Native Americans. The Treaty of Fort McIntosh, which is fairly successful with the Native Americans who participate, and then the Treaty of Fort Harmar that he signs with other Native Americans who didn't come to the first meeting, and that's not so successful. Now, I'm going to really shrink down for time what Harmar's adventures were in the Midwest, but he spends basically the next several years, next 6 years, as senior officer of the United States Army, trying to bring peace to the area. Now, there's a bunch of settlers who are squatting on properties in the Northwest, but you can't kick them off because no one surveyed the area. So Congress, finally, George Washington comes around, and by which I mean the United States Constitution is ratified, and they end up sending out someone to do some surveys. So they do the survey, and then he can finally kick people off the land. But by then, people are trying to move in already, and there's this big hassle. There's a lot of back and forth, and eventually the Native Americans start skirmishing with them. And what really breaks out, we know as the Northwest Indian War. Now, this war kind of was never declared, and in fact, there were major criticisms of George Washington fighting this war without going through Congress to declare war. But the truth of the matter is that 5 years before the ratification of the Constitution, Harmar is already out there fighting the Native Americans in smaller skirmishes. Now, he ends up in 1790, in October of 1790, going on what's called the Harmar Campaign, where he goes through to try and root out some of the Native Americans who just won't come to the table and sign treaties or won't honor the previous treaties. Now, his problem at this point is twofold. First of all, he's only given militiamen from, I don't remember all the states. I believe it was New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut. I don't even recall Virginia sending militiamen. And some from Kentucky, which at this point was still technically Virginia, so there's that. But these militiamen are not very well trained. They are only supposed to come for a few weeks. Many people actually don't want to go, so they'd rather stay on their farms and make money and pay someone else to be a substitute for them. So you're getting kind of the least trained, lowest regs of society coming in, and they're not good soldiers. Now, the other problem with Harmar is he was a big fan of Baron von Steuben. We still have pretty big fans of Baron von Steuben. He wrote the Blue Book and helped train the Continental Army to win the war. And he trained them in old English, European style fighting. Now, that helped a lot in the Revolutionary War, but 10 years later, it's not helping so much in the Northwest Indian War because the Native Americans fight with what they call the Indian style, but what we would call guerrilla warfare. They would hide in the trees, they would be quiet, they do a lot of sneaking around, not seen as gentlemanly when you're going by Steuben's Blue Book, but seen as effectual when you're the Native Americans fighting the war. Unfortunately for Harmar, he really sticks to this. Now, he ends up having a lot of criticism for George Washington because he's saying he was excited when the Constitution was approved because, as Hamilton argued in the Federalist Papers, hey, if we come together, we can have an army on our borders. Like, one of the arguments for a standing army was, why would we have poorly trained militiamen go for 2 weeks at a time to defend our borders when we can pay soldiers to do soldier things and make sure we don't have problems with the Native Americans? Granted, he didn't talk about having offensive wars against the Native Americans, though at the time, most of the people living in the United States considered this to be American land because they had won it in the Revolutionary War, and most of these Native American nations had fought with the British in the Revolutionary War. So when this land was ceded by the losing army to the Americans considered it theirs because the Native Americans had fought with the British. They were part of the losing army, so the treaty that ended the war, they should also obey. Native Americans didn't feel this way, obviously, and there was some warfare. So Harmar goes on his little excursion, the Harmar Campaign. It does not go well, and he suffers Harmar's defeat, it's called. He is routed. It is the third worst loss in the history of United States versus Native American warfare. He is replaced the following year with Arthur St. Clair, his old friend, who comes in as governor, takes over, and 1 year later would have St. Clair's defeat in almost exactly the situation, and it would be the number 2 worst loss to Native Americans in American U.S. Army history. The third was 100 years later. It's eluding me right now. It's not the part of history I discover. I want to say Little Bighorn, but that might be wrong. Don't quote me on that. But either way, not going very well. Of course, shortly after Arthur St. Clair's defeat, Mad Anthony Wayne would be sent by George Washington, create the Legion of the United States, which is really the foundation of what we now consider the U.S. Army. And the Legion of the United States would win the Northwest Indian War, which again was kind of an undeclared war and maybe unconstitutional. Who knows? It had started before the Constitution, so maybe it was grandfathered in. That's not for me to say. What is for me to say is Josiah Harmar would go back. He would actually, before he left, he'd stay on under St. Clair for another year and be part of the next defeat the following year. But he actually receives a court-martial. He asks for and receives a court-martial, which vindicates him of any wrongdoing, because he did go by the book, the Blue Book, Baron von Steuben's Blue Book, which was the manual for the U.S. Army at the time, so he did technically follow all the rules, and he did obey what he was instructed from George Washington, despite saying in the first place, I don't have enough manpower, and the men I have are not ready for this kind of war. But, George Washington did say, go do it. And he's commander-in-chief, so he did it. Didn't work out, but he did it. He goes back to Philadelphia. He actually becomes Philadelphia's state adjutant general, which is a part of the army. I've always said this. It basically helps oversee the business of an army. It's kind of like human resources for an old-time army, for lack of a better term. And I apologize to any adjutant generals out there for my mispronunciation of the word and my extremely brief and probably not 100% accurate way to describe the position. But it is a business type position in the army. And he spent several years there. And again, he actually goes back to his estate in Philadelphia, where he was from this whole time. He had been away for 7 years as senior officer of the United States Army, and finally gets to go back home and live a private life. So that is, again, an extremely condensed assessment of Josiah Harmar's participation. I kind of skipped over his participation in the American Revolution to get to his really important role in, despite it being kind of a failure, his extremely important role in the establishment of the Northwest, or what we call the Old Northwest. Rocking through. Matthew Danver, how do I know so much? Well, I write these articles every week, every day. So I do a lot of research writing them. Even the William Floyd one, like I volunteered a decade ago at his house, but last week I wrote the article. So I made sure I read through, got all my information, published an article within the last week, and then in the half hour before I turn on my live video, I reread all the articles I just wrote just to get it in my mind, and I sound a lot more impressive than I actually am. And I enjoy it. There's really the main part here. So we're going to go to our last founder of the week. This is actually today's founder of the day. If you were to go to founderoftheday.com, this is the one that would pop up for you. So let's talk about Sir James J. Excuse me. Wait, let's have a sip of water. Gotcha. April Fools. Okay. All right. Our next founder is Sir James J. Sir James J might sound like a familiar name, and if that's the case, it's because he had a younger brother named John J. Now, John J is really well known as one of the most important founders. Top 10, easy. So John J was born about 13 years after James J. So James J, what's interesting about the James J is their father, Peter J, was a fairly successful merchant in New York City. But before John J was born, while James J was a young man, they all got smallpox. And actually 2 of their siblings were blinded by smallpox. So they end up moving north of New York City, just north of New York City driving today, but kind of far north back then. to a farm. And while they're up there, they're still pretty wealthy, and James J. is actually sent to Europe, where he studies at Edinburgh, to become a physician. Now, he ends up staying and practicing in Europe for a very long time, almost 20 years. John Jay doesn't know his brother very well because his brother's in Europe for so long, so much of his childhood. He leaves just a few years after Jay was born. John Jay was born. But James Jay, while he's over in Europe, helps raise money first for the College of Pennsylvania, which we now know as the College of Philadelphia, which we now know as the University of Pennsylvania, and then puts even more time and effort, and one is really arguably the main funder of King's College, which we now call Columbia. At the time, just one of the most important new universities in North America, if not the world. Really important to education. Because of his work funding King's College, he is knighted by the King of England. George II, I believe it was. It wasn't quite George III yet, I believe. 1762. So one of the last things King George II does is knights Sir James J. Now, a decade after that, the American Revolution is coming around. In 1775, John Jay writes to his brother and is a little bit nervous that James J., having been in England so long, being Sir James, is going to side with the British. But to everyone's surprise, Sir James J. comes back from England, and he supports the Patriots. And he brings with him something very interesting. Invisible ink. He has two concoctions that he's created. One is to write invisibly, and another one is to make it visible. He gives this to his brother, who then transfers it to George Washington in the Continental Congress. George Washington used to call it sympathetic stain. I've also seen it referred to as white ink because it would be written on white paper and you wouldn't see it because it looked the same color as the paper. This was used to communicate with Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane and Arthur Lee in Europe, who were at first working secretly trying to get France's support, but before then had to be done in secret. And additionally, it would be famously used by the Culper spy ring, headed on Long Island, headed by Abraham Woodhull. They would communicate to the man inside New York City, Robert Townsend, with this invisible ink. Now, the show Turn says that they use lemon and blah, blah, blah. The truth is, James J. never actually published how he made this, so we don't really know how he made this ink. It's lost to history, but we know they used it because it's been referenced in so many different places. Now, what's really interesting about James J. is he actually is elected to the New York Provincial Congress, the revolutionary government of New York, which his younger brother helps write the Constitution, then becomes Chief Justice, and then later does all these other John Jay things. James J. serves there in this state government, but he ends up becoming pretty dissatisfied. Now, the next thing I'm about to discuss is very murky. It's hard to determine exactly what happened here, but it certainly seems that James J. communicated with the British and got himself arrested. He is arrested by the British government and treated as a spy and then sent to London, though it seems he may have gotten himself arrested so he could continue either living in New York City, which was held by the British, or live in London, where he had spent most of his life. Now, to defend him, Sir James always said he was loyal to the Patriots and that he was just arrested and he was caught. No fault of his own, whoopsie daisy. Many people question his loyalties, including his brother John Jay, who really doesn't communicate with him for the rest of his life. He says something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing here, but if a child of my father could devote himself to the Patriot cause for so long and then just leave and go to the other side, I will pretend I don't have such a brother. That is a paraphrase. It's a close paraphrase, but it's a paraphrase. And he does. John Jay would later go to France to help, sign the Treaty of Paris and end the Revolutionary War. While he's in Paris, his brother James Jay is in Paris also, and they don't see each other. And then later, John Jay would go back to Europe and go write the Jay Treaty in England, and his brother was in London at the time, and he did not see his brother there. Now, Sir James does eventually return to North America, and he becomes a physician. He's still a physician, and he connects with some of his old relatives. He actually ends up tending to William Livingston when he's sick at the end of his life. Now, William Livingston was governor of New Jersey forever, and his brother John Jay's father-in-law. So even though John Jay wasn't talking to his brother James, his father-in-law, William Livingston, was still using him as a personal physician. And he basically, James J. lives out the rest of his life. Sir James J. lives out the rest of his life in New Jersey as a physician. And there's one more thing I stumbled on that I thought was fascinating. He ends up writing a letter to President James Madison at the end of 1811, just as the War of 1812 is about to set in. So 2 decades later, he writes a letter to James Madison essentially saying, hey, there's some smuggling going on here. You might want to check into this. It looks like they're trying to break the tariff laws, and they might be adversely affecting our readiness for this war. You can publish this letter if you want. I'm comfortable with that, but you might want to keep it a secret, because if you keep it a secret, I can do more spying for you, which was an extremely weird way to wrap up his life as a person who was accused of being, on the wrong side from time to time. But nothing much comes of this because James J. passes away the following year in 1812. So that is a brief overview of an inventor of invisible ink. Not the inventor, because it's come and gone throughout the years, but an inventor of the invisible ink used during the American Revolutionary War, Sir James J. That is pretty much our week in review. Thank you guys so much for coming. I see some. I started reading Redcoat by Bernard Cardwell. Its starting chapter is intense. Okay. I am not familiar with Redcoat by Bernard Cornwell. Definitely let us know how it goes, Misfit. I am reassessing my schedule so I can read more. Speaking of which, thank you guys so much for putting up with my experiments this last little while. I'm now going back to basically what the most successful form of Founder of the Day was, which is Monday through Friday. With the difference being these weekly wrap-ups are on Thursday, and tomorrow's Friday. Tomorrow's trivia. Make sure you guys come tomorrow for trivia. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday will just be regular videos that I will pre-record. Although I am going to be still doing interviews. I'm going to be, at this point, since I'm pre-recording them, I don't have to worry about scheduling people at exactly 8:15, so I should be able to get more people to come and talk to us about their perspective on certain parts of the American Revolution. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you especially to my Patreon supporters who, with your donations, are extremely helpful in offsetting a lot of the costs I've incurred over the last 3 years putting this together and offering as much free content as I possibly can. But if you want to see some behind the scenes stuff, definitely go over and check out my Patreon page. Other than that, you guys are amazing. TJ, you're very enjoyable. Thank you for coming. I will be back. Oh, we got something else. We support everybody. Yeah, no, you guys are awesome. Also, I am going to be diving more into the Discord channel. We let it slip a little bit. I'm going to be making it a very concerted effort to at least be posting one thing every day in the Discord channel. If you are not part of the Discord channel, feel free to message me on any social media or email me below, because the links only last 24 hours, so it's not really worth putting in the description. I am more than happy to welcome any of you to the network. And with that, I suppose we are pretty much done here. So we end every week in review with tricked you again, April Fools. I'm not sure what to call this. Do I call it 7 Stories of the American Revolution? Do I call it Week in Review? Leave me some comments or think about it for a day or two. Let me know a trivia tomorrow. What do I call this weekly wrap-up? My last 7? I don't know what to call it. But either way, I'm out of here. Round bottom.